So we're going to make a vase and a bottle today, and then the vase is more straight up and down, but then we're going to collar in the top like this, right? So we make it very narrow, right up here. We'll teach you that, how to turn this into what we call a bottle form, where it's really closed in. This is something that's a little bit tricky, but it's doable, and it's really fun, right? Because it teaches you all about form. The main thing about this is that you will also learn how to make a taller cylinder. So you're going to start with more clay, and then you're going to try to use that clay super economically, like make sure your cylinder's even, not leaving clay behind at the bottom of the cylinder, like really focusing on that. Then trying to make it go up as tall as you can, right? And then we shape it into some sort of form that you like. And then as part of this, I'm going to take that vase and then collar this in and make it like a bottle form. We'll talk a little bit about what the difference between a bottle and a vase is. So first of all, always start off with good clay. What does that mean? Like putting in air quotes. Like I got this clay fresh out of the bag, new, right? It's not clay that I've been throwing or whatever. When we talked about plates a couple last week, was it last week or some last week? You could use clay that you've thrown a bunch before, because that clay is just sitting mainly flat against the wheel head or the bat and only has to rise up a little bit. This one, we're always trying to push ourselves, make ourselves stronger, better, whatever. We're always trying to use up the clay most efficiently, right? All that, right? So how do we start? Well, you want to start with a ball of clay that you feel a little bit uncomfortable with, meaning like it's a little bit more than what you would normally feel good at centering. Because you know, like you probably got the cup size clay, you probably got the bowl size clay, because we're doing those a lot. Now, as you want to improve and get better, the next step is trying to tackle larger chunks of clay, because I cannot make a really tall, nice, fancy, big cylinder with only a few pounds of clay. I got to up my game to bigger piece of clay. This is a lot like, this is going to be a physical activity, so you have to physically learn how to do it. No matter how good a thrower you are, if you've never thrown bigger stuff, it's a struggle, because it takes more oomph and body position and longer and more endurance physically. So you have to learn how to do that as well. So it's a battle physically, and you have to do it. And then once you get there, then you'll become good at it. So I used to throw these big 25-pound pots, take basically a whole clay, wedge it up. I would never just start with 25 pounds. I would start by throwing like 10 pounds or 8 pounds for a week or two. And then I would go up to 15 pounds or whatever. And then I would finally, and I do that till I kind of felt like I was getting up to speed physically and mentally. And then like a couple of weeks later, then I'll start throwing the 25-pound pots, right? So I'm starting with a piece. It's hard to just jump, right? So don't slap down a 10-pound piece of clay, right? You just want to get bigger than what you want. So one way you could do it is if you're really comfortable 2 pounds, but you haven't thrown bigger than 2, just take 2 2-pound balls and throw a 4-pound ball, right? Let's try that. So that's where I'm starting here, is a 4-pound ball of clay. I'm going to paddle it into middle. I wedge the snot out of this, so it's wedged up really good, right? Also, that since this is such a physical activity, right, you want to be physically good to go and mentally good to go. If you're tired, if you're stressed out, things like that, it's hard to perform at your best, right? So also try to get good night's sleep and all that. Try to be psychologically balanced, whatever you need to do, coffee, whatever, you got to get going, right? Because it's a physical thing, right, that we're doing. But it's important. The most important part is to be doing it, right? If you don't throw down 4 pounds or 8 pounds of clay, then learn how to do it. You'll never know how to do it ever. If you never do a bottle, you never learn how to do it ever, right? All right, so this is a 4-pound ball of clay. You can start with that. You could do a 3-pound ball of clay, especially, or even a 2-pound. Make little vases and bottles, because that will teach you how to color in and control the form. But eventually you got to up your game to something this size, or 5 pounds of clay, right? So here we go. Put it down. You see that I'm throwing on a smaller bat today rather than a bigger one. Why? because this cylinder is going to go up and be tall, I'm not going to spread this clay out like a plate. So I can get away by throwing on this little bat. And I slapped it down. You can already see that it's way off center, right? I don't know, you see how it's more that way than this way. So before I even start centering, I'm gonna just do some slapping around so that the minute I put water on this and start centering it, there's like a timer that starts. The clay is always, once water hits it, it's getting softer and softer and softer, and I limits the amount of time I have to work on it. But right now, I can just, either I can peel this off, try to re-put it down, or I can, see that how I'm just taking one side and I cup my hand over and I'm kind of mashing it over to one side. You see that? I can even push it in like that, still that way. So I'll just let that piece go over there. So you see how I'm centering it kind of just by smacking it around. Now, little piece of clay, when you're doing like a 2-pound ball of clay, you can just like, and you can just hold there and it can kind of almost center itself. These bigger pieces, since it's so much effort too, right? We're trying to limit that effort, right? The physicality. So it's not very cone shaped, right? If we look at it, it's kind of this misshapen mass. So let's also take both hands like this, right? And I'll just paddle it from both sides like that and try to whoosh it up into kind of the shape that it's going to be, right? In the end, right? And you could do this with all your pieces, right? Even a little piece of clay, you can do a little bit of this. You can see it's still oscillating around a little bit. So I'll take this and just keep smooshing that side in a little bit. It's getting there. Oh, did I just do the wrong side or something? Okay, it's close, right? You see that? It's not too bad. So it's good. So I've never gotten it to where it was completely centered. Okay, but here we go. So I want to have very good positioning, right? It's just re-emphasize the fundamentals. So when I teach people to throw, my goal in life was always to be able to throw taller cylinders. So I adjusted the way how I teach throwing and the way I throw normally to make these tall cylinders. So that's the way I throw, with a few extra tricks worked in there. So I'm gonna have to be really stable. Since there's more clay, the wheel speed, right? That's really fast wheel speed. Because there's more clay, I have to go slowly, more slowly, because you need time, like when that clay, mass of clay starts coming around, right? When it starts coming around and pushing you out of the way, you gotta have the strength and react more and push back, right? Because there's more mass. If you go too fast, the clay is just gonna whip you around back and forth. So go slower, and then you're like, to keep the clay from pushing you back, right? This will take longer to center than normal, right? And you see how slow I'm going? I'm going slow and then going up. Right? Now, some people say, well, if I use softer clay, it's easier to center. Yes, right? It's easier to center softer clay, but the clay then, it doesn't want to stand up in the cylinder. That makes sense very well because it's softer. So I used reclaimed clay yesterday I was throwing, but that cylinder I made wasn't very good because it was too soft and it wanted to collapse, but the centering was way easier. Right, so I did one raise up and down, right? You can see the faults in it. It's not there yet. So I'll do it again. I go slow and I bear down on it, do my thing, right? So part of this is physical, so you just got to learn by doing, right? And so if you haven't thrown something big before, you're kind of upping your game, kind of like lifting weights. Right? You go till you get tired, you get a little, you may even feel your arms like getting a little flared out, like that's okay. Then just go on to something else for that day, and then you'll recover, and then you'll do something else again. You can come back to these another day, right? So it should look a little bit better each time. Let's show you a different way of centering, right? The top part is always easiest to center, right? So let's just pull this whole thing off a little bit, right? So I just made it more uncentered. Let's talk about a couple different techniques of centering, because I was centering just by like oofing it up, right? Just like normal centering. So that is off center again. A couple tricks we could do to really center this is I go up and down a couple times, right? But it's still way off. So what I can do now is I can just try to focus on this top part, I just ignore the bottom part of this. So what does that mean? I will bear down on this and just center this. You see how I didn't start at the bottom? I do that and I go up like that and I let go. And then you see how that part's centered? This part still isn't centered, right? And there's somewhere in here it goes from centered to uncentered. That's fine, right? Because the top part's the easiest center. So at least some of it is centered. Then I'll push it back down. You see that, how I pushed it back down? And then instead of just starting right here, remember, I didn't start at the bottom. I'll just go a little bit farther down and then try to center that bit, right? So I'm kind of what, I guess, I can't remember where I learned the centering in parts, right? I'm centering the top part and then pushing it back down. And I go a little bit farther down, I center that part and I go back down, right? So I'm just gonna grab this part right here a little bit lower. Oh, that's so far off. And then I go up like that and try to get it centered. You guys see that? So how is this super important for a piece of clay this small? I don't know, but when you get bigger, like 10 pounds, it becomes really important for me to center that way, because I can't just try to center the whole thing. It's like, you know, when you have this giant crazy task to do that's going to take forever, and you break it up into little steps, right? And you do each little step along the way, and that adds up to the whole thing. That's kind of what I'm doing here, is I'm centering just the top part, pushing it down, centering a little bit more, and then pushing it down, right? So always make sure this top part is always centered, right, when you're done, and then I push it back down. And then each time it goes up and down like that, it should become a little bit more centered. If that, and then now I'll try grabbing the whole thing and centering it. So mainly center the top half at first, right? And then push it down. And if you're able to get that part centered, then you go a little bit farther down and you go up and down with that. And then once I'm close to there, now I can center the whole thing. See that? That makes sense, everybody? You got to try it. You may not need to do that technique. If I had a 10-pound piece of clay, that's the way I would center it for sure. It's still not quite centered down here, so I'll push this in a little bit. There we go. So we're ready to go. So I'm also thinking about how wide this mound needs to be, because the width of this mound determines the width of my cylinder, right? It's very difficult. I'm feeling like that's pretty good, so I'm going to push it down, get it close to opening stage, right? I'm going to flatten out the top. All right, so I'm feeling pretty good. So the width of this mound determines the width of my cylinder. Sorry, give me a second. Got to turn off my phone. It's not my phone that's actually ringing. It's connected to that, my watch. Bye. And then we'll disconnect you. These phones are very odd. Every time I plug it into my car, it connects everything back on. Yeah, and I wish it didn't do that, because most of the day I leave it. All right, so now back to the thing. So this width of this determines the width of my cylinder, right? Let's say, for example, I wanted a cylinder wider. I can't make a wide cylinder out of this, right? Or I can't make a plate out of this, right? Even if it was on the right size bat, I still couldn't do that. But this is okay for a cylinder this wide, or even a cylinder a little bit smaller. The other thing it's good is that most of this clay is going upwards, right? Remember when we did plates, we made this really wide mound, right? It's hard to make a tall cylinder out of a really wide, short mound. It's almost impossible. So here, I'm good with this mound shaped like this. Right, and now I'm ready to open. So let's get a little bit closer for the opening. Hello, up close, right? I'm gonna wet this down. Remember, I curl my finger over like that, and I just start there. I make the hole. Now this is a bigger mound. It's taller too, right? It's taller. So I am going to go down a little bit, but then, you know, like, that's about as far, when I'm making cups and stuff, that's about as far as I go, or bowls, right? And usually I'd be getting close to the bat. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, because it means we really got to reach a long ways down, right? And that feels like we're doing so, and I get a little crowded in there, I can do this. I do this little trick sometimes where I stop there and I will just pull back and make a false bottom, right? What did I just do? I just opened up a lot more space. And then I will restart my hole here again. That makes sense? Do I do that every single time? No, but I do it. a lot of the time, and then I'm going to stop for a second, and then I will check my depth with my needle tool. Let me point this around this way so it has a slightly different, better view. Let's check the depth with my needle tool. The one thing that's doing the false bottom, it does make these little extra ridge lines here. Let's stab it, check. All right, so it's that thick, so it's a little bit thicker than normal, but you can leave behind whatever you think you want, right? If you don't, like if you're just gonna have a flat bottom vase without a foot, you can make this much thinner, right? How much clay you leave behind down there does determine what your cylinder is, right? It is a lot of work centering a larger piece of clay, right? It is, and then any clay that you're leaving behind on thickness can't be used for height, but then you also want to leave behind enough thickness if you want to trim a bottom, for example, right? So I do want to trim a bottom, so I'm leaving that behind. So now I'm going to widen, so I curl my hand over like that. I'm going to pull straight back toward myself. I'm really keeping an eye on this bottom here. I'm watching to make sure it's flat. See that? Oop. You see how this is up a little bit. There's like a little crater there. I went up for some reason. Now I'm going back down. We'll fix that. Right? I'm not doing the best job at doing this. Okay, I'll stop right about there. Right? And then this is the time to fix this, because when I make this into a tall cylinder, it will become really hard to see what's in there. When I stick my arm in there, my arm will be taking up all the space. So I want to make sure that this is nice and flat and happy, right? So I'm going to take this, my 3 fingers like that. I use the sponge on the side of the clay that's spinning away from me, and I just like smooth her out like that, make it beautiful, right? No one's ever going to see this, right? Unless they throw it on the ground and break it open, right? Because this will be a bottle, so the neck will be super tiny, but for me, it's important, right? And I take my time and do that. You can even take a rib and really compact it down. So I'll use a round side here. Just do that. I'm doing it lefty because I'm lefty. Right, that part lefty, that's good enough. Woohoo! So I'm ready to go. So I'm ready to start raising. So this is the next part that's going to be a little bit different. A lot of times when you initially do the hole or raise, you'll see how this is a little bit wider, right? You see how it's a little bit wider. It's flaring outward, right? You see how it's narrower here and wider here. So we want to manage the overall shape of this always, right? What does that mean? I mean, we want to take this and we want to make it narrower at the top always. I'm trying to get the camera in the right place. So here, I'm going to wet this down. I'm just going to do like a small centering. I'm just going to squeeze this in like that. You see that? How I'm able to make it now. So it's not flaring out anymore, it's flaring inward. You see that? So now I'm ready to do a raise. Woohoo! So actually that's not a bad spot for the raise, but we have some things to talk through. So this is pretty chunky, right? I want to raise and be pretty aggressive here on my raise. The theory with raising a good cylinder is you kind of get 3 shots at it, at really doing a good raising pass. Like, there are other things that happen, but really thinning out the clay is 3. So you can try to do more, but you really only get 3 good ones. So you have to get the clay thinner. So I have to get the clay from this thick, right, to something reasonable, right? And then you can kind of look at this thickness and say, if I make it half as thick, it will be twice as tall. That makes sense? If I make it a third as thick, right, 1/3 that thickness will be 3 times taller. In theory, right? So I have to be pretty aggressive, right? Because I have to mush this down pretty hard, and that takes some oomph. So I could do my normal finger thing, but let's do, when I push the outside, I want to drive in with more force. So everybody take their finger, you know, like the classic, like I'm pointing at somebody. So everybody do that. Like I'm pointing somewhere, like go over there, kind of point. I know it's rude to point now, right? But you see that? I take this finger, I roll them up, and I roll my thumb over. So everybody do that. And then just bend your finger at this knuckle here, and then this knuckle here, your index finger. So you see how that is sticking out like that? And then roll your thumb on top. So everybody try that right now. And I am actively pushing down with my thumb against here. And I'm actively curling this in like that. Like, huh? and then her, right? So what does that do? You'll feel it now. That becomes like a kind of a hard like tool thing, right? And because it's closer to my body and less appendages, less weak joints in between, I can drive into the clay harder. So pointing, like you're pointing at somebody and then you roll that knuckle in, that knuckle, the pointing finger is sticking out, and then I stick that on top, my finger on top, and I push it down, right? So where did I learn this from? Just like you guys, I learned it from my professor in college when I was undergrad. He was very specific. This is the way I do it. And then you see that from here, I use this interface, you know, like when it's straight like that, but then, you know, when you notice that when you curl this up, a little like blob of flesh kind of squirts out right here at that knuckle. There's a little blob of flesh now that's out in space a little bit more. That's where I'm pushing against my clay, like that, instead of my fingers. And it's mostly, you'll notice that my hand is mostly vertical, and it's like pushing in like that. Does that make sense? All right. What is the rest of my hand doing? From the inside, I am doing the same thing, pushing outward. Remember, the outside hand is lower, so it's like that, right? You see that? Tung, 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 tung. Now, first thing that I always do is I want to look inside, right? Before I do this, I need to plan out what I want to do. Oftentimes on the inside, that this has a pretty clean inside where it's flat, flat, flat bottom, and it makes a pretty kind of like right angle-y turn there, and it's going straight up. Oftentimes, right, when you look inside your cylinder, there's lots of extra thickness clay here coming in. So how do you fix that? Before I would do this first raise, right, when I'm in my position, before I start really pushing from the outside, I do a lot of pushing out from the inside to kind of hammer that thickness out, right? I want it to look like this, flat bottom, clay going straight up and away, right? That's a very good habit. I'd much rather have you have even cylinders. It's more critical to have even cylinders as someone learning how to throw than to make tall cylinders. It doesn't make any sense, but let's do an analogy, right? Let's say you walk purposely with a limp, right? And you're walking and you're getting around okay, but you're a healthy person. You are not practicing like best practice walking skills, right? But when you want to run, and if you try to run with that limp, you learn how to do that the whole time, it'll kind of mess you up with the running part, right? You can still go faster, but if you had continued to walk with a normal gait, right, running, you'd be able to do faster, better running, right? That makes sense. Or think about like when you hold your pencil. If you hold your pencil really goofy when you're writing, like there's all sorts of ways people can draw and write, right? But in art, we try to practice people holding it a specific way because it allows you to be more creative, right? Physically, you're allowing your body to help you, right? Same thing here with this. It's much better a habit to have this straight up and down because then you're not going to run into trouble later, right? So I'd rather have you thick cylinders with a straight evenness, right? So you see how this is already even? If this was thicker down here, I would hammer a lot harder at the bottom when trying to raise. All right, so here we go. We're going to do the raise now. Let's get there. I guess that'll work. And then here. So I wet the whole thing down really good. I don't care how much water I'm using, right? The critical part is getting a good cylinder. If you're worried about how much water it is you're using all the time, you're thinking about the wrong thing, in my opinion. You can worry about the water later, right? Clean it up. So I just soak the whole thing down. You see how it's all slippery? I do that move. I will connect them together and it's going to be like that. You see how the outside hand is lower? So at first the clay, oh, I forgot. If sometimes you notice that when you get the clay ready before you do your raise, it's not exactly even out here anymore. There's like a chunk or peninsula or something going around. You can trim that off by doing this, by just like how you undercut your clay, you want this to be round down here and straight. That makes sense, everybody? So take care of that. And then I wet it down. And then here I'll push in, push out. So here we go. Push in, I'm pushing out for the inside and I'm raising up. I forgot this bat wobbles a little bit on here. It's because one side of the bat is lifting up. It usually only happens there. So now I just did one raise, right? I was pushing harder down here as I go up, and then I moved it up to there. You always then, after you do your raise, you want to do some maintenance. What do I mean by maintenance? First of all, you always want to restore the cylinder shape. So if you look at this shape, this shape is a little bit goofy, meaning it's not quite cylindrical. What do I mean? Because probably to you it looks okay. You see there's a little bump that's a little bit out here. Let's push that in. All right. Right. The one thing that you're really fighting is always its instinct. It always wants to become a bowl. Right. So if you're having the problem where your cylinders are flaring out a lot, so pretend that there's a center axis here. Right. So let's back this up a bunch. Pretend there's a center axis there. Not quite used to this new webcam. And then when I'm throwing, I purposely feel like I'm throwing toward this center axis. Right? That's psychologically in my mind. I feel like I'm pushing harder from the outside. That will help me keep my cylinder form. Right? So if everything's turning a bowl, drive more with the outside and make it feel like you're pulling in toward that center all the way a little bit. That sometimes helps. All right. So let's do the next raise. So you see how I restored this to a tapering like cone shape, right? If this kept going, it would be a cone shape. So here we go. We'll do it one more time. We'll do one more raise. So I wet the whole thing down, I'm checking to see if it's even. So let's look inside, see how even that looks, right? The walls are not, they're the same thickness all the way down. So once again, if it's thicker below, this is my last chance to fix that on this next raise. If it's thicker in the bottom quarter down here, then what would I do? I would push harder on the bottom to really thin that out, right? Because you work so hard now, you have to center it, right? Any clay that you end up leaving behind is like an opportunity that's kind of lost, right? And the clay that you leave behind will end up is clay that you had to go through all the work of centering. Look at this. What's happening? All right, I got to get used to my new. All right, so any clay that I leave behind is clay that could have been used for height. Right? And then if you want higher, then you got to start with even more clay, right? So ideally, efficiency, evenness of the cylinder are key, right, to this. When you're doing larger piece of clay, lots of clay will come off on your hands initially. Don't worry about that, right? It's just part of the process. As you get better, that will go away. So I'm going to be pretty aggressive here again, right? My idea maybe is to get it like up to there somewhere, right? So this is raise number what? 2, right? So I got one more after this. I'll do one more like this, right? I push that in, and I'm gonna push in, right down here, like that. I'm being pretty aggressive, so I'm gonna wet that down in because that got dry. Here we go. Raise up. Now I have to let up the pressure here, right? The critical part is evenness. So I let up the pressure there in the middle. And then I'm really starting to let up the pressure here, meaning, because it's just that the clay always at the top part moves so much better, right? It just squirts up into the air at the top half, right? So that seems okay, right? And it seems about even thickness. So let's look inside to see, right? It's looking pretty good. Right? And then I'm going to wet it all down again. So I got one more raise. So I go back to maintenance again, right? Where I'm going to really take my time and do some work on it here a little bit. Let's see if that camera will stay. I'm having issues with my camera. Oh, it should stay. Stay, please. All right. So, man, the other camera was just the right amount of dirty. All right, I got it. I think I got it. Because the grit and stuff, I think, would hold it in place. All right, there we go. All right, so now I have to do some maintenance. I'm going to push this in a little, right? You see that? Get it more up and down. Because think about it this way, right? You know, like a Coke can after you drink it, or a soda can, you can stand on it and it'll hold your weight. But the minute you put any kink in it, like you ever do that, you tap the edges, it goes, and it compacts. That's because those straight edges are stronger, right? Just imagine if they made your Coke cans just tapering in a little bit. It'd be even stronger still, right? Like think about the pyramids of Egypt, man. They're going to be around forever right? Because they're a tapering in shape, right? So because this is going in, so why is that important? It's because then that this shape is stronger, so I can make it thinner, right? And it'll stand up better to my dragging on the clay, right? So this shape is stronger. Any kink in it, right, just like your Coke can, the minute you put a kink in that soda can, it collapses, is a weak spot, right? That's the place where it's going to collapse. So I'm constantly straightening this guy out. So here we're going to wet this whole thing down again. Wet the whole thing down from the inside, right? Here we go. So this time I'm going to switch to my fingers, right? And I'm going to try to do this. So this is pretty deep in here, right? So I have to throw with them separately, right? So that's hard to do. The minute I get close enough, I'll link them together so I can feel it. And I still got to exert way more force down here than I do up here. My hope is maybe up in here somewhere. So I'll wet it down again. There's some people that throw with a sponge in their hand. I never learned that way. I've never been comfortable at that. Right, so, all right, here we go. This is the last raise I get. Taking some time, get that a good line established. Here we go. So why do I switch to my fingers for this one? It's because I have a really good feel for the pressure of the clay, how much pressure I'm up. I lost something there, so I got to go back a little bit. So with my fingers, I have a much greater feel for the clay and how it's reacting underneath my fingers. That makes sense? And I'll explain what else is happening here in a second. I got a few other ideas for you. All right, woohoo, that was great. I'm super happy. The clay was responding super well, right? And so around here, I realized I was doing great. So I exerted my more pressure because I felt that the clay could handle it. You know, so we use this for this piece of clay, right? When I'm doing bigger, even bigger pots, I use, everybody point to their wrist, like right there. There's like that bone on the opposite side of the thumb. I use that when I'm throwing bigger, really big chunks. Like if it's an inch or thicker, I come in with that and I push that from the outside, but that's a really blunt instrument. The reason why I don't use this for this final raise is that I'm too forceful. Right? I can't modulate the pressure. All right, so that's looking pretty good, right? And then inside, we want to mop up all the water. So there's tons of water in there. We want to mop all that water up. Like that. Right? You notice I wasn't complaining about the water up until now, right? I didn't care, right? I've been focused on getting a good tall cylinder this whole time. The best cylinder I could, so I'm spending some time cleaning it up. I'm not really smoothing out the bottom. I just need to get all that water out, because if I leave that water in there now, I'm in trouble, because the things I'm going to do next to it will create problems, right? Because I'll close the top off, right? And I won't be able to get in there later. That's looking pretty good. It still needs a little bit more. I think I got it. All right. So then what are we going to do? We are going to rib the inside and outside. So I'm first going to straighten it out, because you see how it's a little flary here. I'll push that in, right, like that. It's pretty straight up and down. There's a little bit of a bump here. So push that in. This will help make the next step much easier. So here, we're going to rib the inside and outside. So here, the inside rib, I'll just use the curved part. So this will be the inside there. The outside one, I'll use the flat edge, but there's a special little trick. What I'm using, so that's the way they would look, right, if I did them straight up and down. I use the flat edge of this one. But what we do with the outside one is, if you look, I turn it like that a little bit over. What does that mean? So if you can see in the video, you can see that when it's touching, it only touches here in the middle part of that rib. And you see how this part is not touching, this part is not touching over here. So it makes a very good quote unquote flat spot. Why? It's because if I do it flat, this cylinder isn't exactly straight, and I won't have good control over where the rib is actually touching. So by turning it a little bit, I can focus. The rib will only be touching exactly on the cylinder where I'm pushing in, right? Because here you see this part's out a little bit. If I hold it flat, this part as I'm going up will hit that spot early, right? And so you'll see it. This is turned a little bit while I'm pushing out with this one. So what am I doing? It's like opposite. So this is turn and I go up together like that. Start here at the bottom. Turn a little bit, up we go, and I'm scraping off all the slip and goopy, and then I'm making a smooth surface as well, which is awesome. I love the smooth surface. I am not a big fan of throwing lines, right? Throwing lines are not my happy place. There's a really great potter. His name was Don Rice. He used to smooth out everything like this. He was doing these giant, big, beautiful forms and wood firing them. He smoothed out everything after he was finished throwing because he said as the artist, he wanted to make the first mark, right? For it to be a conscious thing, not to be just a record of how it was made, right? So if you're leaving the throwing marks, that's perfectly valid, but you're just showing, you're leaving the marks of how it was made, right? It's just a little bit like leaving the canvas marks from the slab roller, right? Those canvas marks from the slab roller, it's just evidence of how it was made. So you see I do this several times, like that. So that's looking pretty good. We'll leave it like that. All right, so now I have to think about what I want it to be, right? So I'll clean up my hands a little bit. They're goopy. So, and also, getting off all the slip and all the wet stuff, right? That cylinder was still soaking all that stuff in, right? The clay, the outside was really wet, so I scraped all that out. So right now, the cylinder, I can chill for a second or two, right? So if I needed to go to the bathroom or take a minute, this is the time, right? Because remember, it's been had water on it the whole time. So that whole time, it's getting weaker and weaker ever since I started centering it. Now is a good moment. I clean off my hands, and then I'm going to think about what it is. So let's think about what you can make out of this, right? So let's get down here a little bit, and we'll do some thinking about this cylinder. So when I'm making a cylinder, right, or a vase form or bottle, there'll be a body, and the way how we think about bottles and vases and things, we use a lot of like anatomy language. There's like a body, right? There's a shoulder, right? There's a neck, right? So we use like a lot of human anatomy ideas, right? So the language of that. So we can think about this. Let's say we make something that's barrel shaped. What is a barrel shape? A barrel shape is, think about like where they put wine, they have barrels, right? The top of the wine barrel and the bottom of the wine barrel are the same size, diameter, and there's just this curve in between, right? It gets wider in the middle. That wide part is symmetrical, meaning that the wide part is in the middle of the barrel. So let's say we need to leave some clay behind for the rim and the neck and all that, shoulder. So this is the part that I could make the barrel shape out of. So if I go halfway down, right, that makes sense? That's where the widest part of the barrel would be, right? That makes sense. And then I would close it in to make the vase. So that's if the body is halfway. So this is a little bit like that, except it closes in a lot more. Hey, so you see that? The wide point is there. I probably had to leave that there. So this is probably started off as a barrel shape. You guys see that? So let's just use that as an example. If you wanted a higher shoulder, you would just move the wide point up higher, like up to there, right? And you guys can play around with that idea. We'll probably end up with a higher shoulder because it's kind of fun to show that. But we're going to start off with the barrel shape. What happens after this line here is, let's just draw it back in so you can see, that's the place that will be the shoulder of the pot. And I need the rest of the clay from here on up to form the neck, right? So I can close it off because I need some clay there. So here we go. So I draw it out, but of course you don't leave these lines. That's just me to show you what I'm thinking about as I'm making, right? So I'm going to use this rib on the inside and just start pushing out. So I know that I do not want to push out any more on here, but this part here, especially right here, needs to travel out the furthest. So what I want to do is I push it out in a way that starts the pot off as like a skinny version of what it wants to be later. Right? Does that make sense? I want to make it skinnier, right? And then it's going to slowly get bigger and bigger as I push it out, this body, right? So you see, I'm trying to establish the wide point now, This is a technique called stretching. And it's a technique that I practice a lot, right? So we'll go back to here. I'm pushing that area out. So you see how it's kind of getting that barrel shape a little bit, right? And then I'll push this out here a little bit more, and then we'll go. So here we go. Nice. There we go. Do it one more time. Now, as this goes out, the clay gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker, right? So you got to be careful. How weak did you make your cylinder, right? If you really want to push it out really far and have this bubbly, beautiful shape that goes out, you have to leave some strength in your cylinder. If your cylinder was almost collapsing, then you can't make it into this beautiful bubbly thing. You got to leave it as a skinny thing. That doesn't mean it isn't going to be beautiful, right? It just shows you just got to leave some strength in the walls, because this isn't even the hard part yet, right? I'll do it maybe one more push. And then we'll go to the neck and all that. Now, one other thing is that down here, the cylinder is always a little thicker down here, right? The width, the walls. So I know that I'm going to come back in here and trim some of that off. That makes sense, to narrow that up. So I am knowing that, so I push that out a little bit more, because I'm going to trim into that just a smidgen. All right, so the body's kind of done. I'm pretty happy with that. So now I'm going to start doing this. And this is a long ways, right? You see that versus, like, see how far that has to come in? I have to get this to go in. So this is the part where it gets kind of fun. Here we go. So I'm going to get my sponge out. I'm just going to wet this down. Just this part. I'm trying not to get this part wet down here. Just the part now that I'm going to work. This is mostly done. I'll come back and make some adjustments in a little bit. You want to look inside, because this is your last moments that you'll see inside, because as I close it in. So if any water got dropped in there, I would take care of that now. All right, so I wet the inside of the cylinder, the top part, the outside here, and now we'll start pushing this in. I think what we'll do is we'll do this technique first. So everybody take their fingers and make like two like L shapes, like that, palms down, and then take your index finger and like crank it in like that. You see that? So it looks like that. You see that? And then you want to rotate so your thumbs are now pointing to each other like that. And then this is the contact points. I have 1, 2, 3 contact points on one side, 4, 5, 6 on contact points on that side. I want to wet them down really good. So I see I dunked them in my water. I'll wet this outside of this down really good. And then what I'm going to do is push in like this with these 6 contact points like this and go up. Oh, it wasn't quite ready. So I should have done the other thing first. So the other thing you can do, that wasn't supposed to happen. All right, so the other thing that you can do is you could also push it in. So we will take this and we'll take my little finger here and push it inward. You see that? How I'm just raising it up and kind of pushing it in. The clay wants to fold up, so we'll see how we try to recover from this. Right, that flaw now is built into the clay, so let's just cut that off. So what happened was the clay folded in on itself, which is really bizarre. I haven't had that happen in a long time. So why do I cut that off? It's just that I found that it was going to be more distracting to me, right? It was going to keep throwing me off. So I'm going to try to straighten it out. So that was a lot thinner than I thought it was there. All right, so I'll wet this down again and I can keep pushing it in. Right, so I wet it down and then I do this little throw thing where I just use my little fingers. I'm just pushing in from the outside and pushing it in mainly, because the clay is pretty thin there already. So you see that? It went in some. I can do it again. Here we go. And this is a point where the clay, so that flaw in the clay is now built in. You see that? We'll see if we can recover from that. That's always fun to see, give myself a challenge, right? And now let's see if we can do this. It makes me all nervous now. Ooh, it almost did it again. So you see that, how I'm rolling this in and trying to continue that curve there by pushing it in, right? And then I'll flatten this out a little, just a little bit. And I'm starting to work this in a little bit more. You see that? Woohoo, right? You see that, how it's going in a little bit. So you can't keep pushing this in for forever, because as this diameter gets narrower and narrower and narrower, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and it wants to eventually just wants to fight back a lot. So then I will go back and do the finger technique, and I'll thin it out a little. This is already thin enough. I didn't realize that I'd thrown this top part so thin, because I was so excited about how the clay was just going, right? Because I've been throwing with Reclaim for weeks now, and this clay was, I just went with it, and I made it a little too thin. So here we go. I'm gonna wet this down again. I'm gonna use my fingers again, right? And this takes a little bit of time. The other thing is, you'll notice that as this gets narrower, I am increasing my wheel speed, right? So here, right? Remember before we were going slow. So I'm just mainly pushing from the outside here, right? Just using my one finger, and I keep it wet. And you see I'm slowly coaxing it in like that. You see that, how it's getting there? So this is still vase kind of territory, right? But then let's push it in. Keep pushing. So when does it become a bottle, right? We instinctively know vase bottle difference. The general rule of thumb is when people, my ceramics teacher said, when this width gets about less than a third of the widest point, right? That's a very loose rule of thumb, because you have bottles or vases that are very narrow, but it also has to do with function, right? If you know that you're supposed to put milk in there or wine, you would call it a bottle, right? And you can signal that by putting a little spout on there. But then there's other things that are like pitchers, right? So if it's a milk thing and you're supposed to put a cork on it, then that's really probably a bottle, right? Or wine, and you jam a cork in the end. So here, I'm gonna wet this down again and wet this down again. I can come back later and fix some of this, and we'll show you that in a minute. Oh man, this clay. I need to really wet this down. It's just sucking up the water. All right, so I really wet it down. We're gonna try to squeeze it. So I see I'm really jamming on the gas. You see that? I did that technique where I went like that. All right, so the place, what's gonna happen? Where is it gonna collapse? This is the weak point, right? Because there I'm having to have the clay travel horizontally inward, right? So that's the place where it's gonna collapse. I can't get my hand in there, right, to fix it if there's something wrong, but we'll come back and fix that in a second. We'll work on it here in a second. I'm just squeezing that in a little bit more. We'll do one more raising pass here, right? So the part of it is I do not, when I'm doing my thinning out, I try not to thin out too much this clay in here. I try to leave some thickness there. So like in here, right? Because I could have, because this, all this right down to here was vertical at one point, right? If I really squeezed that and made it too thin, and when I start working it down, if it was too thin, it wouldn't stand up for that horizontal distance, right? So you see, you got to leave some thickness across that shoulder, right? Let's say it's not quite right. You're like, John, let's say there's a slight part that's like collapsed, right? You see that? I created a part that's like dipping down, and that's not it. You have these curved sticks. You want to wet your stick down, and then you can stick it in there, and then use the curved stick to push it back up. Like that, and then you just kind of eyeball it where it is. So you can now work, because the form looks different now that I've closed it up a bunch. I can even change it. So let's just change it a bunch. I'm gonna really bowl out this shoulder here, okay? It probably would have been better if I took care of this earlier, right, when I had a better idea, but sometimes you change your mind, right? So you see how I changed that shoulder a little bit? I'm going to push there. I'm going to point to where I think it is. It's there, it's there, it's there, it's there. Is this harder to do? It's way harder on some respects. Ooh, I kind of like that, right? I'm kind of liking that it has a more vertical section, and then it has a shoulder that's turning in. I'm okay with that, right? And I didn't know that's what I wanted, but now it happened. I'm okay. So I'm going to now continue closing this in. And then there's a moment where this won't fit in anymore, right? There will become a moment when I can't get that in. I have to, then that's my last moment, time that I can stick this in and make those adjustments. right? If I keep going narrower and narrower. Here we go, wet it down. See that? These are really wet. I do that. I may have to do a little bit more. Ooh, right? That's looking okay. I'm okay with that. So now, little changes here on the neck mean a lot. Because there's like an energy or something that's flowing off the top of this. So let's fool around with this part and you'll see. So right now you can kind of see it's kind of angling toward this hourglass like neck shape where it's like kind of the narrowest in the middle, halfway up, and then it flares out. But let's do something where we make the top the narrowest just for a second. Right? And it's not really what I want to do. I dropped my sponge, excuse me. But you'll see that little changes at the top will change the whole pot completely. It's just like the rims of things, right? So as I close this in, you'll see how it changes the stature of the pot, how it finishes. Now, you also got to think about what's going to happen to this. Is it just going to exist as an item sitting out there on your shelf as just a vase thing, as an art piece kind of thing? Or is it something you want to use? So if you're going to be using it, there's going to be stuff like flowers and stuff coming out of that, changes it a little bit, right? So you see how that looks different, right, than it did before? Let's actually close this in. Let's make the lip the narrowest part. Right, you see I'm going to try to do it. It's not being that cooperative. I'll try to roll it in. Right, so you see how that's starting to close in. You see how that feels like a different pot. It lacks, so before I had that energy like woohoo, right? It's going out into space. Right now it's closing it off. So before, because I had that flourish, right, where I was going outward, it definitely felt vasey, right? But this is feeling more bottle-like. Does that make sense? So I can keep closing. Let's just keep closing it in. So one more shot at closing it in maybe before we finish it. So I'm getting some more length out of it. Really jamming on the gas here. Ooh, look at that. So you see how I was able to narrow it up. So now, this clay here gets super weak because it's not that big a cylinder. It's really small. There isn't much clay. You do not have that much time to fool around with this because remember, just like when we were raising, you got 3 raises. This clay here gets really stressed out and wants to corkscrew and fall off. Right, so I'm feeling pretty comfortable with that. I can come back and adjust the shoulder here a little bit by putting some downward pressure here. This little area feels a little bit awkward to me, so I can take my rib with that beautiful part and kind of push that in to make that part more beautiful. Now this shoulder looks a little bit awkward, so I can try to do this, but I can also tidy this up another way when we get it to trimming. When we get it to leather hard. So I'm mainly concerned for me about this transition that the overall form looks right. I'm not too concerned about the little bumps and stuff on here. I could take a smaller rib because now I feel like this part's finished. This part's pretty much finished. This part I finished a while back. So this part, I want to be super conscious about what happens here now. So you can kind of see we're finishing it now from the bottom up, right? This part's done. I did the shoulder. This part's done. Now I'm working this section. Let's make it like let's make it like an hourglass thing. So I'm going to try to press this in a little bit, right? And just do this, do that, right? There we go. That's feeling okay. I'm going to do this here. And then have it flare out like a little trumpet or something. There we go. So then I'm going to trim off this part. You notice I'm being pretty careful. I only trimmed that off once, right, earlier, because every time I trim, I'm losing clay. So when do I trim this off? Every time the top gets too funky and distracting for you. If you can live with it, you leave it as long as you can, because every time I cut off clay, my cylinder is getting shorter and shorter. But if you need to cut it off because it's distracting, right, that would have, like 10 years ago, that leaving that part uneven for this long would have drove me mad, right? So then I'll just come through and cut this off. Oh, right, like that. And then I need to smooth out the inside. If you look at the inside here, it looks really ragged, right? Because I was doing my raise. So I think I could do it this way. I'm just going to use the inside of this needle tool like that. Do you guys see that? I'm just smoothing it out because I don't like those finger lines on the inside. I can come back with a sponge later too and smooth that out. I'll take this and dip this in here like that. Kind of rounding off the rim. I want the rim to look finished. The one thing that happens a lot when you throw these is a lot of times when you're done, it just looks like you ran out of clay. I lost my chamois. I saw it. Did everybody see my chamois? Oh, where? Oh, it's just so clayed up. So then I'll round off the rim, right? So here, because this is super delicate, I spent some time and got it really wet, and then I'll do this. Ooh. Man, that flaw is still there. You see that from way earlier, right? When I almost knocked my whole cylinder over. But once it's done, no one will tell. All right, so that's looking okay. That's looking okay. So let's back this off a little bit. That's the overall thing. I'm okay with that. So this form here, right? We've never talked about this. I can undercut this a little bit, right? So I'll take this guy here and just patrol in, because all this clay now is, I'm going to trim all that up. I'm going to continue the form, right? So this had clay on it out to here probably. I'm going to undercut a lot of that clay off because it's less trimming later. So I'll just undercut that off. Ooh, almost went too much, right? And then I'll swipe that away. Yeah, and then I'll just wire it. So I always throw these on bats, right? And I always leave them on the bat, right? I like these green bats rather than brown bats for this because I don't have that much real estate on them. So it always just forces me to keep that center mound tight, right? It can't, even though I'm using a lot of clay for these little bats, it forces me to keep it in, right? The mound, so that I'm always reminded that I need to go up. That makes sense to everybody. And plus these bats take up lots of space on my shelf, right? That makes sense. So what's going to happen, I'm going to let it dry. Next time there's some trimming things that have to happen. I'll walk you through all of those for next class. That makes sense. Any questions about this? You just want to try. I don't care how much clay you're using. You can start with 2 pounds of clay and make little guys. Right? And actually, if you're super nervous about making bottles and vases, the little guys are really good because it's not that much clay to mess up. Because if you're not willing to mess up, you're not willing to gamble enough and take enough risk, right? That was a lot of risk keeping this going in. I could have risked it further and made it go up. My old teacher who taught me this used to make them small enough you couldn't even get a straw in there when he was done. And why would he do that? He said he was cheap. He would give them to his wife. He was cheap, and that way you only had to buy her 1 rose, right? And that's what he'd give her for Valentine's. That was his joke, right? So that makes sense. So but he was showing off too, because that's hard to do, right? But he was such a good thrower at these, like he was a master. Any questions? All right, so you don't have to start with as much clay, but it's fun practicing wedging it up really good, right? Being in good shape mentally, physically, throwing, right? Trying to get the most efficient use out of your clay, your cylinder, right? So get a good cylinder, and then playing around with a form, right? Stretching it out, stretching out the body, and then closing this part off. I don't care if you're doing it 2 pounds, 3 pounds, 4 pounds, whatever. Right? The smaller bits of clay are better because you're more prone to try and risk more, and you can get the hang of the closing in part, this part, and then when you transition to bigger pieces of clay, it's good, you'll be okay. The bigger pieces of clay, there's just something really expressive that a bigger form has that a smaller form doesn't. Right? It's really opening up a whole new visual language. Like the surface is so big and expansive and turning. The glazes look different. There's a lot of good things that you get out of a bigger form. That makes sense. So try that. Start with more clay. Any questions? All right, go to work.